feels like a middle school dance. I really don't want to sit on the girls' side. I feel like we just do blue on this side, we're good. Okay. So, again, welcome everybody. Kids, you guys have an awesome day. You probably should head downstairs. So we are in a sermon series right now called Equally Complicated, where we're connecting a guy and a girl each week, kind of talking through the different ways that men are different from women. Believe it or not, men are different from women. I know it's crazy. And really, like, a lot of what we're talking about here are generalities. You know, like we kind of have to talk about like how women are generally this way, men are generally this way. And I feel like there's a lot of things where Autumn and I get to bring some different aspects to this because I do a lot more of the girl stuff than she does. And maybe we should switch sides. I don't know. Yeah, the way we communicate and things like that are very different. So, again, if this is your first time, I want to reiterate what Cody said earlier. You can download the Church Center app and just click Living Faith in there, and we've got sermon notes you can follow along with. What? Okay, so today we're talking about communication. All right, so communication is a really interesting thing when it comes to the differences between men and women, right? I feel like generally, like a woman can take like a flower and can talk about that one single flower forever. Like, can be like, this is beautiful. Like it reminds me of home. The way you smell it, the feel of it. It's just like my favorite sweatshirt. And you can take like a mundane thing and bring beauty to it in a way that's really, really cool. Men, I feel like, can take something that is life-altering and huge and dumb it down to a very, very simple thing. Like I feel like a guy could like watch his son win a gold in the Olympics and just grunt, and like you would know through that grunt that you're saying the decades of hard work have paid off, son. I'm proud of you. You know, like that's the difference in communication between men and women a lot of the time. Now, I say that that's just a generality because Autumn does a lot of grunting, and I do a lot of talking about flowers. Is it wrong? Yeah. So, I think it's on, right? I think our sound guy needs it. So it's dead. Oh, okay. Well, we can check. You want to come meet? Okay. So really when it comes down to it though, like both guys and girls are equally complicated in this, you know? There's no simple side to this, like it's equally complicated. So I remember seeing a conversation one time with Elon Musk talking about being able to transmit information, communicate information. And somebody asked Elon Musk, how long is it going to be before we are androids? Before we are fully like zapped in with the internet and like we are one? And his answer was really interesting. He said, we essentially are already androids, but the speed is really slow. He's like, we have all the world's information at our fingertips. It's all there. We can find almost anything. We can see almost anything in a moment, anywhere in the world. But the speed is really slow. The download speed is what's frustrating. And essentially, like, the frustrating bit is how you express or ingest the information, but the information is there. It's the same thing when we as people talk to each other, okay? You are a very complex person. You have complex thoughts, you have complex feelings. Spiritually, you connect with God in a different way. There's just a lot going on inside your mind. Like, you're made in the image of God. But the download speed is really frustrating, you know? To communicate with somebody else and me to talk to Autumn and to like tell her everything that's going on in here, there's a lot going on, but getting it to her in a way that is received is the hard part. Does that make sense? Yeah. So conversations, communication is really more than just like how you talk. It's really how you download everything in you and upload it to them. That's the conversation here. That's what's really going on. It's kind of the art of expressing what's inside of you while also like filtering out the junk. You know, so it'd be really great if you could just like download it. I think that'd be scary. I'm glad that's not a thing. But yeah, like that's kind of what Ephesians 4:29 says this, and I want to read the Amplified version, which I think says it really well. Do not let worthless words ever come out of your mouth, but only such speech as is good for building up others according to the need and the occasion, so that it will be a blessing to those who hear you speak. So that's kind of where we're kicking off this whole communication thing, is how do we get what's in here out in a way that is a blessing to the other person that comes across clearly, and you don't say things like Persian. So I'm going to kick it off to Autumn and have her kind of talk about the communication ground rules of like what do we all need to do to make sure this is godly and good.
All right. I love how different people communicate. Like, that was just such a computer geek way of introing this whole sermon. What do I download to you? Okay. No, okay, so communication, right? So I'm going to begin with a disclaimer, and the disclaimer is this. So the sermon series is equally complicated, right? That's the title of the series. We're talking about how in like different things, different genders tend to respond differently, right? But my disclaimer is that probably about 90% of what you're about to hear today is really more honestly about personality style or about generational differences or about cultural differences in communication than it is about gender. But just like in all things, like there are kind of typical gender responses. So nobody get like offended when we say, guys, you do this and girls, you do this, because you might be like, I'm a girl, I do that all the time. If that's the case, then great. Listen to the guy part and take it to heart and change and be more like Jesus. But either way, we're gonna start out talking about just in general, what are some just ground rules for healthy communication as brothers and sisters in Christ in all the different relationships that we have with one another across this room, right? So the first one is that communication needs to be Christ-like. Duh, we're in church, right? I had to start with that one, right? It has to be Christ-like. But seriously though, like so often when it comes to communicating, the Holy Spirit in you and the Jesus in you goes out real fast and your flesh comes up real quick, right? When you're trying to communicate something, especially when you're trying to communicate something that you're frustrated about or something that the other person is just not understanding, right? I mean, like we can really quickly just flip on a dime, right? And then all of a sudden just kind of lose our minds and be like, oh my gosh, why don't you understand me? I'm saying it clearly, right? But they're not hearing it clearly. But regardless, our attitude and our words and our actions, our verbal and nonverbal communication needs to be Christ-like. We should look different because we follow Jesus, right? Like, this shouldn't be a communication talk that you would also hear on a TED Talk, right? We should look like Jesus in the way that we communicate with one another. And with that, like, just knowing that the way that we communicate matters significantly more than the content of our communication. Content matters, learn how to say words. But do you sound like Jesus? Are you expressing the heart of Jesus when you communicate to somebody else? Whether you're communicating something awesome or something hard, either way, do you sound like Jesus? Do you have the seasoning salt of Jesus in your words and in your actions as you go? Proverbs 18:21 says this. It says, the tongue has the power of life and death. The tongue has the power of life and death. Our words really, really matter. We need to be careful when we communicate just to make sure that we're being Christ-like and we're representing Jesus in all of the relationships that we have. And I say in all the relationships that we have because I think often in communication, we can tend to be very Christ-like with other people, and then we go home. Right? Or then you're with your best friend. You're with that person that makes you feel safe. And it's like all of that just kind of goes out the window because you're like, he knows my heart. You know, but like it doesn't matter if Neil knows my heart or not. It doesn't matter that we're married. Like what matters is that I'm communicating like Jesus no matter what, no matter where I am. So our communication needs to be Christ-like. Our communication also needs to be selfless. This is one of those areas where it's so easy to just, when you're having a conversation and you're trying to communicate something, just to think like, why on earth are you not normal? Like, I'm saying this, and it makes total sense, and you're just saying something entirely different.
You're making a lot of eye contact.
It's been a great week, y'all. It's been a great week. Sermon preparation is fun.
And also keep in mind, like, this is not talking about marriage.
Right.
It's not talking about marriage. Also, if you're married, take this. But this is just men and women communicating.
Yeah, just in general, when you're talking with people. It's so easy to think that, though, just like, and the reality is, like, what is normal, right? Normal to me is different than normal to Ben, which is different than normal to Tyler, right? And so it's less about, like, me trying to get everybody else to be my style of communication, and more about me being selfless in the midst of that, and me learning their style. So if I'm selfless in my communication, then the point of our conversation is going to be about understanding each other, right? When I'm selfish in my communication, then the point of the conversation is being heard, right? There's a lot of focus in our world today on, I just need to be heard, right? And there's some value to that, but also, like, who are you hearing? You know what I mean? If it's all about me being heard, then that's just a very selfish way to approach every relationship that we have across the board. So being selfless, being sacrificial. Proverbs 18:2 is another one. It says, the fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. So don't be a fool. That's what the Bible says. Okay, so communication needs to be Christ-like. It needs to be selfless. Communication also needs to actually happen. And here's where one of those gender things comes in, because so guys, I'm mostly talking to you in the room, right? Ignoring things does not help. You have to actually communicate. Ignoring things does not actually help. You have to actually communicate.
Amen. This is
All right.
for you.
Here we go. Ephesians 4:15. Here we go. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is head, that is Christ. Notice the word speaking in that verse. Speaking the truth in love, not just thinking about the truth, not just wishing something would happen, not just stuffing it because it doesn't really matter that much, right? Like, speaking the truth in love is how we become mature in Christ. So if you are unable to communicate things in love, then your maturity in Christ is going to be stunted. You're not going to be able to lead people well then. And that's what God's called you to do. He has made you and called you to lead people in your life. And you're not going to do that well if you're not speaking. So speak, write, text, whatever you have to do, get words out and communicate the things. And also just kind of throw in a little side punch here that, like, the stereotypical strong, quiet man is, I mean, like, that might sound nice, but, like, who knows what's going on there, right? Like, that's the most confusing thing ever, especially for a girl. Where she's like, just say something. Like, why are you so, like, strong and quiet? This isn't who you have to be. We were actually watching a movie the other day, and there was a scene in the movie where it was a father and son, and they were boxing in a boxing ring, right? And the dad got distracted by something, and the kid punched him and, like, got him really good. And immediately the kid, I mean, he's like a teenage, like 10, 12, somewhere around there, like young kid. And he was like, oh, are you okay? I'm sorry. And he goes, no, I'm fine. And then he remembered they were fighting, and he was like, oh, yeah, does that make me a man? Because I got you, I hit you. And his dad looked him in the eye and just, like, dropped his gloves and said, no, hitting me doesn't make you a man. Looking at me and asking me if I was okay, that's a start. And I was like, ooh, that's powerful. Like, that's good right there. That's what we need to be teaching young men around us, and men, that's what we need to be doing. I'll also say, though, women communication needs to actually happen, right? When you're having a fake conversation in your head with the person that you're frustrated with while you stress clean, that's not productive. It's also not communication. You might come to a resolve in your head because, man, you worked it out real great. Yeah, all right, I'm hitting something here.
Can I tell a funny story?
Sure.
So when we were writing this, Autumn was like, everyone does that, right? I was like, I've never even heard of that. That's a thing women do?
Yeah, we do it all the time. We have fights all the time.
Is there any guy here who does that? Okay, yeah. Okay. All right, there's a couple. And I also added having a dream about somebody doing something bad to you and waking up being mad at them. That's not real either. All right, let's move on.
So say the things that you need to say them out loud, say them in love. We'll get to that part in a minute when we talk about communicating in love. But communication needs to actually happen, right, guys? Yes, talk, he says. Okay, communication needs to actually happen. At the same time, communication doesn't always need to happen. Okay? Girls, I'm mostly talking to you here. You don't need to say something just because you're thinking it. There's a thing in the Bible called discernment.
Notice how she's not making eye contact.
I'm not. That's very intentional. We need to use discernment in things that we don't say, right? There are a lot of things that, and they might be good things, they might be hard things, whatever it is, they might be things you're frustrated about, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. There are often times that we have things in our mind or have things in our heart that need to stay there. They need to be points of prayer. They need to be things that we redeem because maybe they're sin, right? Like whatever it is, use discernment in the things that you don't say. Now, here's the funny thing: as we were like looking up scriptures on communication, different things like that, I like kind of stopped at one point and was laughing, and I was like, I think the majority of these verses that we found in the Bible about communication are about holding your tongue. Like, there's a lot more in the Bible about not talking than there is about talking. Both are important, but the tongue holds the power of life and death. And if we talk before we need to, or when we shouldn't be, then our tongue can bring death, not life. Proverbs 21:23 says, "He who guards his mouth and his tongue guards himself from trouble." So I'll do that.
Yeah, that's good. So I want to talk for a bit about differences in communication, like different styles, different techniques, just different ways that our brains work. So personality and gender differences, like in just the way we communicate, are going to happen no matter what. And the important thing here is to find compromise, to find the middle ground, and to not just always have your way in the way you communicate. So do me a favor, look to somebody next to you, just look around, look at the people that are sitting next to you, just stare at them, look at them, wave maybe, whatever. Okay, I guarantee you, those people you just looked at communicate differently than you. And that is good. It is not wrong that they do it differently than you, okay? So now turn to them and say, you're not wrong for being different. All right. Now if you're married, turn to them and say, you're always right. No, I'm just kidding. That's not true, don't do that. The point is, anytime you have two people speaking to each other, you have at least 3 different ways of speaking. Like, everyone does things differently. Everyone is going to communicate. Everyone's going to communicate in a different way. I'm not calling out faces on that one. Romans 14:9 says, "Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification." The goal here is mutual edification. It's to communicate well, to have a connection with that person and be able to share your heart and hear their heart. And that doesn't happen if you're just trying to get your way on the way that things work. So one of the main differences in communication is internal versus external processing. There is actually no gender connection between internal and external processing. They've done like a bunch of different studies on this, and it is pretty much evenly across the board. Men and women are even. And most of the time, if you take a group of people, half of them internally process and half externally process. But when we're talking about communication, you can't not talk about this because it's so huge. So here's what I mean by that, okay? Internal processors, like if I was like, hey, how would I take care of this issue? If you would be quiet and think about it and go through a list in your head and then answer, you're an internal processor. If you would just start talking and then find out what you believe by the end of it, you're an external processor, okay? Now, internal, external. If you know, raise your hand if you're an internal processor. Okay? Now, raise your hand if you're an external processor. Okay, so more externals in this room. That says a lot. That means a lot. So I want to say, like, neither is wrong at all. Okay? If you are talking to an internal processor, then you need to give them space to process. And then the thing that they say can be taken like it's written in stone. You know, they've thought it through. It's what they believe. If you were an internal processor talking to an external processor, you basically ignore the first 90% of what they say until they arrive on what they believe, and then that is what's set in stone.
Well, don't ignore it. Just know that they don't mean it until they get to the end.
I'm an external processor. You can ignore 90% of what I say. The final thing I say is the important thing. You can. You're my kid. So, to give you guys an example, while we were writing this, Autumn and I together wrote this sermon today, and she had a list of like, here's all the things we want to hit on, And I was like, I'm just gonna start talking. Can you just write it down? Like, and that's just kind of how it was. And like we landed in a really healthy spot in the middle because of that. We just think differently. So if you don't know how somebody prefers to communicate, ask them. Get to know them and find out. So the next thing I want to look at is over communicating versus under communicating. Okay? Now this one there is a gender norm in this. So overall, men tend to under communicate and women tend to over communicate. Right? That's just kind of generally how it works. So women are more likely to explain a thing and then connect it to 5 other things and explain kind of the whole web of all that stuff. Men are more likely to lean on logic and just like, here's the answer, that's the answer. You know, like that's essentially how people generally think. Again, neither of those is wrong, really. And one is not overthinking it and like totally going overboard, and one is not just an idiot and not saying anything. Like both things have value. And when people that see those things, those different ways communicate, it's actually a really beautiful thing. And what's in the middle is usually really healthy. You know, it's a really good place to land. So, men, I'll tell you this: watch out for the frustration that comes when a woman in your life asks you a bunch of clarifying questions and just wants to dig in and find out more. Like that's not nagging. That's not pushing to an unhealthy level. It's seeking to understand you and understand what's going on. And women, don't be frustrated when men hear something and just respond. And you're like, well, you didn't even care. You didn't even go to all these steps. Like, it didn't even matter. Because they did. They just communicated in a different way. You know? Now, granted, there's sin that can hide in both those things. But in general, it's healthy to be able to speak that way. The other thing is verbal versus nonverbal communication. The majority of communication actually is not the words, it's the tone, it's the face, it's the like movement with your hands and different things. If I'm saying I was really happy what I did last week, you don't believe it. If I say I was really happy what I did last week, you kind of believe it. I was like, man, I was so happy with what I did last week. Like I said the exact same thing, but it came across very differently, right? So again, neither one is wrong. You know, just communicating the words and the logic or kind of going farther into it and saying more. So in general, men are more likely to use nonverbal cues to communicate, and women are more likely to use words to communicate. So a guy might say 1 or 2 things, but the look on his face and his body structure and all that says a whole lot. Where women are more likely to be a bit more toned down on those things and just keep communicating using words and different verbiage and that kind of thing. So, women, that doesn't mean that the guy you're talking to is cold or heartless. You need to look beyond the words. You need to hear the words, but also see everything else. And men, a woman using 10 words to describe something that you could have done in 1 does not mean she's weaker or is going overboard. Like she's trying to go farther to help you understand it. Like that's a very selfless thing. So the important thing here again is not to be like I want it the way I want it. It's to appreciate the differences in the other person and understand the heart behind what they're trying to get across. So in that too, I'll say this, and this definitely applies to marriage in a big way, that oftentimes people will flip to the other way of communicating when they're angry. So if you're a person that only uses a couple words and you just say things straightforward, often guys that are that way, when they're angry, will go the other way and just flood with emotion and flood with words and get big and get really, I don't know how to say it, like just get kind of intimidating in the way that they say it. And they'll just like push to try to like shut down the other person. And a lot of times people that are that way, that over-communicate, like often women when they're mad, will give you the cold shoulder and just not say anything and just walk away in order to show anger. So I think that's a pretty normal thing, but you've got to realize that if you are going to over-communicate to show anger, when you hear somebody over-communicating, you see that as anger, even though it's not. You see it as negative, even though it's not. Does that make sense? And I think sometimes it works the other way too. So you just need to make sure that you know what their default is, so you don't see it as negative. Okay. So the last thing I want to say in this, and this is where we see, I think, big gender differences, is just insecurities. When you're communicating from a place of insecurity, in general, women are often afraid they're going to be too much, and men are often afraid that they won't be enough. Does that make sense? Like, women are wired to be nurturers who support people around them, who do things to serve in a really selfless way. And I think the fear is that people are going to see that as coming across like you're just too much and you're just all over the place, you're overbearing, and like it's just a lot, you know? And men are wired to be providers and protectors who stand guard over people, who keep things peaceful, who keep things in working order. And the fear is that people aren't going to trust them and aren't going to follow them. Like, the fear is that they won't be enough and they won't live up to the expectations of people around them. That's a part of the reason that there are so many guys who are just like, I've never heard my dad say I love you or whatever, and they're just like so broken and so hurt that they've never been encouraged in that way that they are enough. And women are in the same way, feeling, well, I didn't get this from my mother, like, and she just thought I was too much, and like she couldn't handle me, and it was just a lot, and like it's a hard place to figure out where to land. So often when people are insecure, they actually overcompensate or they swing the other way. So if you're a woman, like, you need to make sure you're not pushing yourself on people to find validation. That you're not overcompensating to get somebody to say that you're not too much. You kind of end up becoming the thing you don't want to become. Also, women don't retreat and give the silent treatment to see if you'll be pursued. That's just a place of insecurity. And men, I would say, don't demand respect or allegiance from somebody. You can't demand respect. You can't demand somebody to follow you and think that you're enough. And also, I'd say, on the other side, men don't run away to avoid conflict because you're trying to protect your pride. You know, I think men often will just completely retreat in order to like have the pride of, well, they would have followed me if I was there, but I'm not. And I think it's really easy for us to fall into those things. Proverbs 12:18 says, "There's one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." And in all these things, in the way that we process, the way that we communicate, the way that we show insecurity and that we show vulnerability, all of this needs to be encouraging the person who we're with. And the wisdom of this is bringing healing, is of bringing good stuff to the conversation. And I think communicating often can be really disastrous if we're not doing it in that way.
I'll add one more thing to that as well and just say, all of us listening to this are like, oh, dang it, I do that. Oh, man, I do that. Oh, this person I met with this week does that. Like we can think of all these things, these unhealthy patterns that we have, but especially for those of you in the room who have kids, let me give you a reminder that all of these patterns start when you're this big, right? And so it is imperative that as parents and as the church, right? Because church, we do like baby dedications, right? Parents come up here and they hold their sweet little babies up and we say, hey, we're going to commit to help you raise this child in the Lord, right? As a church, we commit that to the parents in this church. And we need each other. We need to be a solid tribe where we help our kids learn how to communicate. And remember that no matter what age, male or female we are, most likely females are going to be afraid that they're too much. And males are going to be afraid that they're not enough. So speaking the truth over them, even at that age, is going to begin to set that healthy pattern of communication that will last throughout the rest of their life. So just a little plug there for parenting and helping parents. Okay, so we're going to shift and talk a little bit about conflict conversations, because that's a big part of communication, is having conflict, right? We've done a ton of teachings at Living Faith on how to have healthy conflict, so go listen to those. This is not going to be a long version of that, but the biggest point here is have it. Okay? Conflict is not a bad thing. Conflict can be a fantastic thing. Conflict breeds intimacy like nothing else can in your life with different relationships and different people. And conflict is 100% unavoidable. Like you just, eventually it will happen. And if you're the type of person who avoids conflict, you probably avoid it because it's so terrible when it happens, but if you would just have it in the small things, you probably wouldn't be so terrible in the midst of it, right? Because usually when we avoid, and we push it off and we push it off, and we're like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, it's not that big of a deal. Then something happens and everything flips and it all comes flooding in, right? As opposed to just handling those things one by one as they come, right? And not allowing that conflict to be something that like takes a hold of our hearts. So the question with conflict is, do you want your conflicts to be a one-time conversation that blows up and potentially destroys a relationship? Or do you want it to be an ongoing conversation that's done in love and comes to a resolution at the end, right? Hopefully that's where we're all going to lean. But that's not easy, and it takes effort, and it takes energy, and it takes dying to yourself, and it takes guts to walk up to somebody and say, hey, can we talk about something, right? That's not an easy thing to do, and it's not an easy thing when someone comes to you and says, can we talk about something? Because what happens then, right? Our boxing gloves go on, right? That's what we tend to do. Like, we naturally become defensive when conflict comes our way. But if we as people can learn how to take those boxing gloves off and remember that conflict is the fact that you're initiating a conversation with me and saying, can we talk about something, means that you love me and you care about me and you want relationship, right? If you just avoid me, that means you don't really care, right? That this relationship doesn't really mean very much to you. So have the conversations all along the way and show love in the midst of them. So we already read the verse, speak the truth in love, right? Don't shy around it. Don't be all wishy-washy. Be like, oh man, it's kind of like this. Like, just say what you need to say it in love, and have a conversation and come to resolve at the end of it. Always doing that with kindness and respect, right? So the male and female side of this, the gender side of this, guys tend to approach a conflict conversation as a task to get through, right? It's usually a list of logic and facts and truth. Okay, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and so we need to do this to fix it, right? That's a typical male response. The other side of that is guys tend to prefer to talk about one thing at a time and bring it to resolve, and then go to the next thing and bring it to a resolve, right? Because we're kind of checking things off as we go. And, okay, we got that, okay, are we good now? Great, let's go, right? That's how guys tend to communicate. That's not wrong, but it's just different than how women tend to communicate. Women, we tend to approach conflict as a conversation that's a chain of events that we kind of go in and out of. Because in our minds and in our hearts, all of these things are connected, right? It might have been 3 different events, or 3 different things that happened, or 3 different words that were spoken, or whatever it is, but they're all connected in some way because we tend to approach things from more of a feelings and relationship standpoint, from more of an empathetic standpoint than about tasks and facts and logic.
Yeah, I'll just say too, like, not only are both of them okay, like, you almost need both of them to see the whole picture. Like, you know the saying, like, you miss the trees for the forest, or you can't see the trees for whatever it is. Yeah. I mean, it really is that way. Like, it's really easy to see a forest and not see every single tree, but it's also really easy to stare at a tree and forget you're in a forest. And I think both sides bring health to it when you can see it both ways.
Yeah, when you can listen to each other. Guys, because of those different communication styles, right, kind of what it is, often there's a tendency for you to come across in conflict as being overly harsh and criticizing. You might just be thinking, no, we're just trying to figure out the facts, right? No, this is how this was done, and we should have done it another way. Like, you're just thinking about facts, but it might be being received by the other person as being criticizing and being harsh. And women on the other side, there's a tendency for us to come across in conflict as emotionally manipulative. Now again, just like Gail said in the other thing, there's also sin that mixes into all this. So sometimes men are being harsh, or women are being harsh, or being manipulative emotionally. But recognize in each other that when we have a conversation, if I'm being emotional in that conversation, I'm not necessarily trying to manipulate you with my emotions. I might just be emotional. It might just be a heartbeat. There might have been 30 other things that happened before this conversation that have nothing to do with this that I'm crying about. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to cry.
Again, not always gender specific.
Well. These different Bible tells us to speak the truth in love, right? Right? Seasoned with salt, all that kind of stuff. James 1:9, nope, not 9. James 1:19 says this. It says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." Proverbs 15:1 says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." So bottom line, what Scripture tells us is slow down, calm down, speak less, right? Listen more. And the more that we can do that with one another in all the conversations that we're having, regardless of who we're talking to, the more Christ-like, the more selfless, the more sacrificial we're going to be in our communication. So one really practical thing, and we do this in when we're doing premarital counseling with people, we do this a lot. There's we have just this sheet that has, I don't even know, 100 and something words
you
on
want
it.
to email.
Yeah, we'll email it to you if you want it. It just has a whole bunch of different words that are different emotions and things like that. And we encourage people to use this template for a conversation, okay? The template is, I feel blank when you blank. Okay? So a big part of this is learning to use our words. I say this to my kids a lot. Say more words, right? Yeah, she's like, yeah, I know. Because I'm like, how do you feel? Sad. Say more. Sad doesn't really tell me. What are you upset? Are you stressed? Are you angry? Are you heartbroken? Are you there's so many words in the English language that we can use that will much more clearly communicate what's going on inside of me as a result of what's happening than just saying I'm frustrated and ending with that. Very often we tend to just have words that we say over and over and over, and then it just means nothing in the conversation because the other person isn't really actually being communicated with. So using that kind of template, I feel blank when you blank. Not as a place of putting blame on, that's not it. It's a place of communicating what's happening and how it's affecting you in the moment, so that you can do that. So women, we tend to think in the midst of this, how does he not understand how I'm feeling right now, right? How is he not getting that this is an emotional thing, right? And then men tend to just feel honestly, men tend to just not feel until they're forced to. In a lot of cases, that's it. Because in our culture, it's been said, men don't cry, men don't show emotion, men don't, right? And that's just bull. That's just dumb. It's so dumb. It really, really is. You have emotions. God created you as an emotional being. God is also an emotional being, and every single person in here is. And those emotions matter. We need to learn how to communicate. Again, neither one of those is right, neither one of those is wrong. We just need to learn to use our words and say more words and say different words. Get an app on your phone to learn more words. Whatever you need to do so that you can help communicate. And then as always with conflict, the basic conflict things, right? Seek reconciliation, right? It's not about having an argument, it's about getting to an answer at the end, right? Nobody wins in a conflict conversation. It's not a me against you in any conversation. It's a, hey, let's figure this thing out so that we can be on the same team moving forward in every part that we do. Also, just be mindful of the timing of when you have a hard conversation with someone, right? Pay attention to what's going on. Probably 2 minutes before church starts is not a time to say, Alex, we need to talk, right? Because then you're just distracted through all of church or you miss everything, right? So pay attention to the timing, find the right appropriate moment to discuss issues with people, and avoid making those assumptions that just make you feel, will make them feel like you're not even listening to them. But with conflict, if we just have the conversation, just have the hard conversation, just open it up and have it, then we're going to be able to understand how that person communicates. We're going to be able to understand, the depth of relationship and be able to grow in those relationships with one another. And yeah. That's all.
Yeah. I also want to reiterate, this is not just romantic relationships. This is all relationships. Right. And if you're not communicating with somebody, guys, if you're not going up to somebody and saying, I feel this way when you do this thing, then you're stuck in it. Right. Because there are times that things happen. Sometimes you actually need to use the word blank. I feel blank inside when you yeah, I feel blank inside when you blank. Yeah. Okay. So the last thing I want to hit on really quick is just encouragement and showing value, showing love to somebody. Okay, so I want you to think just in your head right now. Don't answer it out loud. External processes are going to be hard for you. It'll be fine. when you think about somebody encouraging somebody else, do you think men are more likely to encourage somebody or women are more likely to encourage somebody? So think about it. All right, what do you think, men or women? Women and men. Okay, mostly women here. Okay, you don't have to raise your hand. You can just say both. Okay, yeah, I agree. I think it's both. So here's the thing. I think most people, when they think about encouraging somebody, think about a woman first. And I think that's not because they are more likely to do it. I think it's because we don't recognize what the men are doing as encouragement. And I think that's one of the biggest issues here. So there's this book written by Gary Chapman called The Five Love Languages. Has anyone ever seen that book or heard of it? Okay. So great book. It is written in the context of marriage and relationships, but it works for all relationships. Like, it's just how do we show love to people. So I think it works for parent and child relationships, professional relationships, friendships, across the board, church relationships. So they've actually done a bunch of studies to see which ones men are more likely to connect with, which ones women are likely to connect with. And almost down the board, they're the exact same percentages. Only number 3 and 4 switch. So the most common above all is quality time. The second one is words of affirmation. And then men and women switch on acts of service and gift giving. And the least common is physical touch. I was kind of surprised, honestly, by the layout of those. But I think all of them are needed by men and women, and all of them are given by men and women, but they do it in a different way. Okay, so quality time, men, when they're showing quality time, are more likely to be static and invite people into their everyday stuff. Hey, let's watch football. Let's do this thing that we do all the time and sit there and be together. That's quality time. Women are more likely to want to have thought and energy put into it to plan something. Neither one is wrong. You know, right off the bat, like, we just instantly think the first one is worse. Like, I think most people are like, well, you didn't actually put any planning into it. But really, both of them are really good things. People are just wired differently. Words of affirmation is a big one. Men are more likely to make up nicknames and encourage people with exaggeration or even sarcasm, right? Women are more likely to call out character traits in somebody and say, hey, I see this in you. You know? Neither one is wrong. Both of them are good. Acts of service, men are more likely to fix things or build things that are out of the normal and like call attention to it. Women are more likely to create something or give something that's heartfelt. You know? What? Oh no, I jumped ahead. I'm sorry. I was like, I didn't see
Women
that.
are more likely to take care of the practical everyday needs.
Yeah, that's right.
So like with an acts of service where men tend to do the bigger things that are outside of the normal, women tend to take care of the daily things as their form of acts of service.
Yeah, I legit just skipped the whole section. Thank you. You need to be up here more often. So men are more likely to fix things that are outside of normal. Women are more likely to take care of everyday practical needs, like do the dishes or laundry or whatever, as a way to show service. With gift giving, men are more likely to spend a lot of money. Women are more likely to create something or do something that's more heartfelt. And then with physical touch, men are more likely to like pat somebody on the back or even come across as aggressive. You know, do something that feels negative. You know, in elementary school, the little boys that like little girls throw their shoes on the roof and stuff like that, or like hit them, or like do things that are like that look very negative.
Shoes on the roof.
Yeah, that's a thing.
Anybody else?
No,
That's just you.
That literally happened to a guy in my school where he like stole our shoes and threw it on the roof, and I was like, what? I was like, yeah. Okay, I should have expounded on that.
We get it.
I said it straightforward. I should have gone deeper. I'm so sorry. Okay. Yeah. Women, on the other hand, are more likely with physical touch to do things that are like soft or like linger or just pull in close. So I think those things are very different here. The thing I want to get across is this: is that men, it's easy for you to take some of those things that women would do as flippant or as cheap, and really miss that you're being encouraged. And I think obviously that goes both ways. Men, it's also really possible to misread some of those things as sexual when they aren't. That's a huge one. It's emotion, but really it's just that they are deeper people, like that in that way. In emotional ways. Women, it's really easy for you to take some of those things personally or feel unknown because they didn't go to that extent for you, but really like miss that you're being encouraged. It's also possible to misread some of those things and think that the person hates you when really they really care for you. That's just the way of showing it, especially with sarcasm and that kind of thing. The key to it is this: Proverbs 12:25 says, "Anxiety weighs down the heart, but a kind word cheers it up." And with all of communication, especially encouragement and really conflict, like we talked about, the point is not for you to get your style across. It's for them to understand the intent. Yeah. And they can't understand the intent when you do it in your way. They understand the intent when you do it the way that they get. Does that make sense? And that also works men to men and women to women. We're not just talking, the other way. So men, if you are trying to show encouragement to another man the same way you're encouraging your spouse, it's probably not going to work well. And it could really work badly depending on where you take that. Women, same thing though. Like if you're trying to encourage another woman in like a really like, hey, you did great today, and like that's it, then they're not going to feel loved in that either. You need to go deeper because that's what they're really yearning for. That's what they're looking for. I also think there's a stigma that men don't need to be encouraged because they're less likely to be outwardly showing that they received it. Actually, I wouldn't even say that men and women need encouragement equally. I think specifically with encouragement, I think men need encouragement more. Because again, what we talked about earlier is that men are afraid that they're not going to be enough. And they need to be encouraged that you are enough. And women, I think, are really striving less for encouragement and more for value. They're striving to feel like they are valued, like they bring something to the table, like they are something, and have something to offer that's not too much, because women are often afraid they're going to be too much. So the question again is, what do they need, not what do you need to get across? And I think so often, like I said earlier, we're only thinking, what do I say, not what do they need.
So at the end of the day, like how our gender tends to influence how we communicate can be a tricky thing, right? It definitely can. But it's something that we need to like put effort into learning so that we can have good relationships with one another, so that we can actually be there for one another as brothers and sisters in Christ, and as family members and to our community, right? So it's important that we learn these practical things. If you remember what Yale said at the very beginning of all of this, he said, it's our goal as believers to not only clearly express what's in us, but also to do it in a way that builds people up and blesses them. Right? That's like one of the goals that we have in our communication as believers. The goal is building one another up, is encouraging people, and finding ways to bring blessing on each other. So a reminder that, we laughed about a lot of things, and you're like, oh yeah, I do that, I totally do that. And it's kind of fun to laugh about, but also like, you're not just the way you are, right? We're called to grow. We're called to change. We're called to be like Jesus. And so, hear all of this as a reminder to continually live out your faith, right? To allow the Holy Spirit to change the way that you communicate and to help you be more selfless and more sacrificial and all of these things that we talked about. And just to choose to communicate the way that Jesus does because you represent him where you go, whether that's with your family, whether that's with a team member here on some team that you serve on, whether that's with your work, with your coworkers or your boss or whatever it is, you're representing Jesus everywhere that you go, and so communicating like him matters. James 1:26 says this. This is a heavy one. It says, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Guys, if you want to be an influence for Christ in this community, we have to be able to communicate. We have to hold our tongues. We have to say things in love, right? We have to show and communicate the way that Jesus does so that the world around us doesn't see our religion as worthless, right? If you are communicating exactly like your coworker does who is not a believer, what does that tell them? that you go to church and you waste your Sunday mornings. That's what it tells them, right? But that's not what this really is, right? We're to be transformed and changed, and the way that we communicate should look different because we follow Jesus. So men, take this to heart, please, 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 and learn how to communicate your thoughts and learn how to communicate your feelings. Ask for help. Go to your discipler and say, yeah, that's me. I suck at this. And your disciple will probably say, yeah, you do. Let's work on that, right? Because we know each other. And women, please don't use the excuse of your emotional state to dismiss your poor communication. Okay? We are created as emotional beings, and that is very true, but my emotions do not define the choices that I make to respond correctly, right? I tell my kids all the time, like, you might be losing it and crying and whatever because you're tired, but just because you're tired doesn't mean you can sin, right? We still have a responsibility to do the right things. We still have the responsibility to choose to respond right, even when it's hard to do so because our emotions are all over the place. And everyone just communicate like Jesus. Be like Jesus. Yeah, let's do that. I think if we do that, maybe everything will be great, right? Well, let's go back to that original verse in Ephesians 4:29. I'm just going to leave you with this. Do not let any worthless words ever come out of your mouth, but only such speech as is good for building up others according to the need and the occasion, so that it will be a blessing to those who hear you speak. Write that verse on a card or something to carry with you this week.
All right, well, we're going to head back into worship, but I want to point out really quick before we do that, the connection card that you got when you came in. You can also get through the Church Center app, click sermon notes, and click on Irvington, you can scroll down. But these are just practical things I ask you to think about doing to be able to live this stuff out. So the first thing for men is commit to practice communicating thoughts and feelings this week. Let me just ask you to be vulnerable really quick. Who here has a hard time processing thoughts and feelings? Yeah, we got a few people. So again, that's not just men. You can mark that if you're a girl. But sometimes we just have a hard time doing that, and that is okay. That's a hard thing for you. But it's not okay to just be like, I don't do that. I think we need to learn that. We need to practice that and learn how to communicate our feelings and our thoughts. The second thing here, I just clicked off the app and scrolled back up. The second thing here is I'll be patient with people in my life as they over-communicate. If you are with somebody who is over-communicating, I'm so sorry, Autumn, be patient with them. I'm the over-communicator. The second thing, or the first thing for women here is I commit to practice showing kindness regardless of my emotional state this week. And that is such a hard one. When you're in a bad place, it's so hard to give good things out of a bad place. The second one is I'll make an effort to listen to the nonverbal communication from people around me. Just because you do a better job of hearing people who are giving verbal communication doesn't mean that they need to completely meet you where you are. You need to meet them where they are also. So I encourage you guys, mark off which one of those you want to do or you want to commit to this week on the card. You can put it in the box back there, and you can submit the digital one. We're going to head in to worship, do one song here as we close up, and then we're going to close out our service today in prayer for some pretty heavy stuff that's going on in our church. So let's worship and then go to